Can traits arise that are beneficial to the group despite being maladapted to individuals and their kin? Explain group selection. Explain how genius genes are spread. That's a very interesting one. I'll tell you how it works. This is the theory that I've developed. Basically, genius is a bit odd because genius doesn't breed true. It's a product of a contingent coupling of different genetic variants, which have a very, very low probability of being found in the same individual at any given point in time. So there's a lot of luck involved in whether you get the right genetic elements coming together to give rise to the genius. And actually, Hans Eysenck in his book, his 1995 book, which was called originally Enough, Genius identified 12 such traits. And this process, Jensen referred to in an essay he wrote in 1997. He called this homogenesis. And the way homogenesis works is you have things coming together that produce a phenotype with emergent properties which are wholly unexpected. And he argues that this is due to non-additivity. So where you have these traits which have to come into linkage first, and they give rise to these discontinuous breaks phenotypically. They give rise to these individuals with levels of traits which are totally different from anything that came before. So you have rare individuals made up of rarely ever found in one person genetic variants, where those genetic variants are gelling in such a way that's giving rise to a particularly amazing phenotype. Now, here you have something that group selection can act on. Because even though that individual we know from historical data, we know from the data of Dean Keith Symington, who published a paper on this in 2003, that historically geniuses have enjoyed very, very low levels of fertility. I believe I read somewhere that across all of the eminent men who have been recorded by sundry researchers, like Charles Murray, who has a whole list of them, he wrote a whole book on them, the TFR, the total fertility rate, I think was 0.3, something like one child for every 3 of them. So very, very low rates of fertility. And what this means is that the genius, not only do they not procreate through passing the genes on, but the nature of what they are prevents them from being able to do that. Because when they marry somebody and have children, those co-adapted or those rare gene combinations will break up in such a way that means the offspring are likely to regress to the mean very quickly and are not likely to end up as geniuses. So how does the genius pay for themselves fitness-wise? Well, what they need is they need to come from a large population that contains high frequencies of the various traits that go into creating that phenotype. So this might include a form of otherworldliness. This is a term Bruce Charlton uses. These people are not connected or concerned with material things. They tend to just be concerned with learning and post-materialist pursuits, often to the exclusion of material concerns. You might also have a situation in which they have to have very high IQ, plus a tilted ability profile, plus they have to have high levels of certain personality traits that make them risk-taking, but not too risk-taking. So there's also a kind of altruism might need to be present that make them very willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of whatever big idea it is they're working on. And of course, the benefits to that could be huge if it's a big idea that has major payoffs at the level of the group boosting its competitive success. So the way the genius is paying for himself for this through his output. And his output is raising the corporate fitness of his house group. So innovations in mapmaking, for example, from Gerardus Mercator and these other geniuses, were given the ability for empires to mark out new territory to spread and to increase their biomass that way. Innovations in weapons design, like Tartaglia, for example, who calculated ways of better aiming cannons by measuring flight, the arc of the parabola. If you look at the cannonball in flight, that gave his lot a huge edge over rival city-states in terms of being able to actually aim the cannon right and being able to kill large numbers of the opposing number. So when the group expands, the raw ingredients for genius will also increase in number. Because the more genes you have, the more likely it is you're going to get more of these genetic variants. And the more likely it is you're going to get rare combinations of these genetic variants. So that's how the genius is paying for themselves. They need to increase the size of the pool of raw material that goes into their creation. And if it's a low probability thing, if it's negatively frequency dependent selected, they need a much bigger pool in order to increase their frequency, given that there is an opposing pressure, i.e. individual level selection against them having children, which will reduce their numbers. But Symington found, consistent with what Francis Bacon also noticed in the 16th century, he noticed that geniuses tend not to have very many children. Just to sort of recap it off, a process where a trait can be under negative frequency dependent selection within a group can increase or reduce the constraints on its proliferation by simply increasing the size of the group. Because when you increase the size of the group, you simply increase more of everything. More genetic variants for X, more genetic variants for Y, and that means the probability of getting more of these rare negative frequency dependent phenotypes increases. It's just a simple, mathematically scalable relationship. And that is what seems to be going on with geniuses. Although I will say this about geniuses. They do often come from families that produce geniuses. Although genius has low heritability, you see in the case of Golden Study hereditary genius, for example, or in a more recent study published in the 1940s, we use British pedigree data to corroborate this. These studies both found that, generally, you get these runs of eminence within these big families. Look at, for example, the Scott family of Dublin.